Welcome to my overview video for the Medic Modules Cranial Saw. It's a dual VCO module with an onboard sub, detuning, sync and lots of modulation inputs for both the pitch of the oscillators and pulse width modulation. There's also some onboard glide. So I'll start by going through the features and then get into some patching. So here's the cranial saw, and I'll first work through the features. We've got master tuning. There's also an onboard glide for pitch input, which we'll come to later. We've got a mixer on the right hand side, so VCO 1's turned up now. I'll add VCO 2. We can add detune, either up in pitch or down in pitch, on the second oscillator against the first oscillator. We've got a mod CV input with an attenuator, so here's an LFO into it. Plus a second mod CV without an attenuator, and they both affect both VCOs. We've got an additional modulation input for the second VCO. There's also a sync switch for the VCOs, so the detune amount now affects the harmonic content as the two oscillators are synced. We can make VCO 1 free run, then sync the two oscillators and play with the second VCO's pitch to affect the sync sounds. There's pulse width modulation for both VCOs and switches to select a saw wave or a square wave. This slider isn't a pulse width modulation input attenuator, it's actually the initial pulse width for the square waves. We've got individual outputs for both VCO square waves and the sub, and also the mixed output. And the sub is generated to be an octave lower than VCO 1. So that's it for the features, let's get stuck into some patching. So I've got a sequence running in the background and it's just VCO 1 turned up on the mixer at the minute. There's onboard glide which affects the pitch input. Turning up VCO 2, we can add a second oscillator and then add some detune. Glide now affects both oscillators, or with this switch we can just affect VCO 2. It can be interesting, but it's more useful when we're in the sync mode with both oscillators synced. Having two VCOs on board, we can create some really fat sounds, and I'll change the second VCO to a square wave and add some pulse width modulation as well. With the mod CV inputs, we can add some vibrato effects with a slight amount of LFO modulation affecting the pitch of both oscillators. And these inputs also respond really well at audio rate. I'll now look at the onboard sync features. I have VCO set to free run and I've got a sequencer going into the pitch. With VCO free running, the second VCO is the one that's synced and you get these harmonic changes between the two as the tuning of the second VCO changes. Adding some glide to the sequence, we can really easily get these nice bending sync modulations. Here I have a sequence running that's affecting both VCOs. We could add a sub here, but for now I'm just going to leave it as VCO 1 and VCO 2, and I'm going to create some duophonic lines between the two VCOs. I've got one 8-step sequence running into the pitch input, which is affecting both VCO 1 and 2. This is also affected by the glide amount, and we can just affect VCO 2 with the glide as before. I'm now going to add a second sequence moving at the same speed as the initial sequence, and this is going to go into the VCO 2 modulation input, and we can get both VCOs moving from the initial pitch sequence, and then with the second sequence just on VCO 2 create these intervals which are going to be generated against that first oscillator. let's flick between the waves and move some pulse width modulation. It's really quite quick and easy to get some big duophonic sounds that with two separate oscillator modules may be harder to get, as you'd need them to be calibrated perfectly to track the same. So here I've got a basic sequence going into the pitch control. Taking down VCO 1's output on the mixer, I'm going to take the direct square output for VCO 1 and add that into the VCO 2 input for some cross modulation. Like other cross modulation and FM style patches, with some fine tuning you can get some really interesting sounds. Head to medicmodules.com and under Discover on the website you'll be able to see the documentation, which gives a diagram for this patch and also a description as well. The VCO2 modulation slider acts as an attenuator so we can affect the depth of the modulation. So this cross modulation is a great way to add some extra grit and modulation to an already big fat sound. Now I'm going to look at using the mod inputs for FM modulation. You don't often think of squares and saws for FM, it's usually sine waves or triangles, but there's some great sounds to be had with the oscillator. So here's a static oscillator plugged into the modulation, and I'm going to change the rate of that. The slider here acts as the FM depth control. And then if I send a copy of the pitch sequence, which is going to the cranial saw, to my other oscillator providing the FM modulation, we can fine tune these ratios between the FM and the original pitch, and then these will track along with that pitch sequence. This works on both the squares and the saws, but it's a more pleasing tone to my ear on the squares. And as with the other patches, we can add detune, add in the sub-oscillator, sync the oscillators, and get a lot of other sounds when we start mixing the features. So the cranial saw is a nice big fat oscillator with loads of onboard options to sculpt the sound. The onboard sub adds a lot of depth to an already rich sound. If you head to medicmodules.com for more information, and head to youtube.com/divkidvideo for more videos from me. Cheers.